Hello and welcome to Deus Ex Machina. This is a series of videos where we go over all of the teams in WIXOSS English Diva format at a high level. If you're new to the game and you're wondering what team is right for you, if you want to get some info on the new teams as they come out, which this is one of them, then this is the video for you. If you haven't been paying any attention to the Japanese meta or any of the social media forums or accounts or anything like that, you may not be aware that Deus Ex Machina is widely regarded as one of the most powerful teams, especially as it comes out. So why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons why, but the short version is that they do a lot of things that the other teams do, but they kind of do it just a little bit better. So when you compare, as we'll see with a lot of the cards we go over, a lot of the stuff they do is not new, but the way they do it is either more efficient or they get bonuses for doing it or stuff like that. And as you'll see, they basically have access to a lot of the same tools that the other teams do, but they just do it a little bit better. And for that reason, that's basically what puts them over the top. If you're doing this exact same thing as everybody else, but you're just doing it a little bit better, those little incremental advantages add up over time, and it basically leads to a situation where the team is just better than basically all the other teams who try to do the same things. We have a lot to talk about when it comes to Deus Ex Machina, so I'm going to try to go pretty fast, but we will start, as we always do, with the team piece, trigger a victory. It is an unconditional crush of your opponent's life cloth, then you add a Signy without a guard from your trash to your hand. This piece does cost one, which is different than a lot of the popular team pieces. Ancient Surprise and Senbaka do have a cost, but the other four team pieces do not have any cost, so do keep that in mind. This is basically on par with what the other team pieces do. If you think about it at sort of the bare bones level, the no limit piece is basically crushing a life cloth. It does have the added aspect of preventing a guard, so you can potentially use it in a way to kind of guarantee damage in the late game, but for the most part, you use it to get the double crush, which basically is an extra crush of the life cloth. Card Jockey is similar. There's a little bit of a gambling aspect to it where you may crush as many as two extra life cloth with it, but you may get zero actual value out of it, which is obviously frustrating. Diagram is the same way. Salvage the Future oftentimes just causes a refresh, which, while it doesn't crush a life cloth per se, it does trash one, which in a lot of cases is actually better because it doesn't trigger a life burst. So basically, having a team piece that does one damage is relatively common for the most part. This does have some benefit that you can basically use it when your board is empty, so that if your opponent does trigger a life burst on it, to potentially remove Signy, then there may be no targets, so there is some value there. There's also added value of recurring a card to your hand, which is a somewhat common thing in Deus Ex Machina. They do a lot of that recursion as well, but it does cost one, so there is some cost to getting those benefits for it. So relatively on par. The piece itself is not terribly out of range of what the other teams have, so it's good to see that. In a bit of a roundabout way, DXM also has kind of access to a second team piece. P04 and P05 will introduce some pieces that require two L rigs of the same color on the field. They're a little bit more restrictive, so they kind of have better benefits and stuff like that. DXM actually has two black L rigs natively, so they can use this piece just still using the full team, which is a little bit unique. Sanbaka is the other team that also has access to the white piece potentially, but DXM really doesn't necessarily need the help where Senbaka potentially does. Anyway, this piece, it costs 2 and 1, 2 black, 1 colorless. You get to basically vanish whatever Signy you want, power 12k or less, essentially. Then, if you have 10 or more cards, I guess for every 10 cards in your trash, you get a bonus effect to either add up to 2 Signy that share a color with your center to your hand from your trash, or you can mill your opponent 10. So, for 3 enter, this clears a lane, potentially can cause a refresh on your opponent's deck if they are in that range. You can also use it to refill your hand if you need to as well. It's a pretty nice, good, versatile piece. I'm not sure if this is a piece that you would potentially run all the time, especially compared to something like Xenocluster. DXM probably needs more enter than anything right now, and having a piece that costs enter to do something that and we'll see with the center L rigs have access to basically using abilities instead of a piece. They basically exclude a piece that they have from the game. So you basically opt to not use a piece and then get a bonus effect from depending on what the center L rig of your choice is. Long story short, basically, I don't know how this is definitely a powerful piece for what it is. I don't know how needed it is in Deus Ex Machina specifically, just because they have a lot of other value they can get out of their pieces. I feel like for the most part, you probably want to run Xeno Cluster just to kind of prevent your game plan from being, hampered by your opponent and keeping your resources filled. You probably won't need the lane clearing and the damage. The L rigs and again the piece and some of the Signy. There's just so much pressure that DXM puts on their opponents that having a second piece that also does that probably isn't as important. But it is definitely worth mentioning that you could run both. So moving on to the center L rigs, we're going to start with X because she is the center in the constructed deck. You'll notice right off the bat that we have all three of them pictured, somewhat unique to DXM, and again, one of the reasons why their incremental power is just higher than the other teams is because their level 1 and level 2 center Elrigs have abilities, which none of the other teams do. So if you think about all other things being, well, if you have your level 3 comparable to other level 3s, but your level 1 and 2s also have abilities on them, that just automatically makes them better because you have, again, resources that your opponent's normal teams, the rest of the teams do not. The way that these work is with a mechanic called soul. So what happens is there's a number of different ways to do it, but basically when you attach, you will attach these Elrigs as a soul. They come from underneath other Elrigs. So basically, like for example, if you have X2 out, you can attach X1 as a soul with a number of different ways, which I won't get into. And then attaching that as a soul, there are certain Signy that gain benefits from having souls. The two center Elrigs, X1 and X2, when they are attached as souls, they actually grant abilities to the Signies that they're attached to. So X1, when it's attached, the Signy that it's attached to when that Signy attacks, you get to choose to draw a card or intercharge one. So that's literally just free resources just by attaching it as a soul. X2, when the Signy that X2 is attached to attacks, you get to vanish target Signy on your opponent's field, power 12k or less. So that's extremely powerful on attack trigger vanishing, which I mean, that in itself is also very powerful. So the two really good effects on two things that normally wouldn't have any effects at all. So that right away is awesome. X3, basically whenever you attach a soul, you can discard a card to draw a card. So some card filtering, filling the graveyard, that kind of thing, that's all good. You can, as an action, you can pay 0 red, which is nothing, to attach one of her level 1 or level 2s to a Signy on your field as a soul. So this is a way you can unlock, the abilities of X1 and X2. And again, there are Signy who do gain abilities when they have souls, which I won't necessarily get into those. She also has a once per game ability to exceed 3. So again, you're removing other Elrigs that you've grown past. So you probably not the 1 and 2, because you want to use those as soul. So you have to exceed 3 and then remove a piece from your Elrig deck from the game. So again, which is why I mentioned that Death deck probably isn't as important because you use your pieces for other things sometimes with DXM. So exceed 3, exclude a piece. Then if you do, you can up to 2 target red Signy on your field gain Assassin until end of turn. So Assassin is one of the most powerful keyword abilities that you can have on a Signy. And X can grant Assassin to 2 of her Signy basically for free. You'll have to exceed 3, so again, there's a certain level of working through that to make sure you have the L rigs to do that, and it does turn off some other potentially spells and stuff you may use. You also have to remove one of your pieces, which is one of the reasons why I feel like Death deck is probably not as important, because X just basically has that damage pressure printed on her Elrig, and if you do need to use Xenocluster, you can just use Xenocluster as the piece, and all of the offensive pressure you can just use X's once per game ability instead of using the extra piece, which again you'd have to pay for as well. It's another consideration. So a lot going on here. It's a lot to take in kind of all at once, but basically the short of it is the level 1s and 2s have abilities on them. The level 3s, you can use one of your pieces to leverage it as a way to use an ability on the L rig, so you don't have to, you're not tied to the 2 pieces you bring to the game. You kind of have a third piece in a way. It's basically that each, if you think about it, that each center has a piece printed on them as well. So very flexible. X especially is extremely aggressive. I mean, X2's once per turn ability when it's attached to Soul is so good. I mean, that's the kind of ability that has a lot of restrictions normally applied to it and would typically cost at least 2 enter, I would think, to have something like that. And she just gets it for free. That's just so powerful. So Moving on to Deus, her level 1 and her level 2 abilities are very similar. Level 1 being the Signy that has the soul attached. When it attacks, target Signy in your opponent's field gets minus 8k power. Level 2 is the same thing, except it's minus 10k power. So both of those, extremely good effects. Those are the kind of things that you would basically... Parajulis basically has almost the exact same effect at the end of the day that Deus 1 has, with the exception that Parajulis requires you to enter charge and it costs 2 to use. So the fact that you can use Deus 1 and just get this for free, once it's attached as a soul, I mean, so much lane clearing and offensive potential between Deus 1 and 2. Deus 3 has a constant effect that during your turn, if you have a Signy that have souls attached to them, then your opponent's Signy across from them get minus 2k. You can potentially use this to vanish some small Signy that your opponent may have out there, a way to basically clear lanes, again, for free, potentially, if you can kind of leverage it that way. She, again, has the soul attached power. Her once per game exceed ability is to add up to 3 target Signy without a guard from your trash to your hand. So extremely good at refilling her hand. Deus really wants a lot of graveyard recursion kind of filling abilities, which shouldn't be surprising. So whereas X is basically all offense, Deus is more about filling your hand up and giving yourself options that way, and basically using that to kind of overwhelm your opponent. Finally, we will move on to Machina, who of the 3 DXM centers, she is widely regarded as the weakest. Not to say she's bad necessarily, I think she does have some good value to her, but when you think about what the other 2 centers do compared to what she does, it just feels like they do it a little bit more efficiently, and that's kind of where the line gets drawn. So her level 1 soul ability is when it attacks, you get to add target Signy without a guard from your trash to your hand, so a little bit of hand refilling and recursion, which is pretty good. Level 2 is when the Signy attacks, vanish target level 2 or less Signy on your opponent's field. So that's a pretty good effect. I would say I wouldn't say it's strictly worse than Deus 2, but in a lot of ways, I mean, if you compare Machina 2 to Deus 2, the fact that Deus can potentially hit some level 3s that are 10k. There's not a whole lot of 10k level 3s that are used, but you do have that option. So it's when you compare them side by side, it's a little bit weaker, but still usable. Machina 3's auto effect is whenever a Signy with a soul attached to it attacks, you put the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck into their trash. So this effect is okay. It's nothing to write home about, really. If you think about the fact that you will have just a limited number of souls throughout the game, um, even if you kind of add up all of that milling effect over time, it's not the kind of thing that you can really use to break the bank in the way that like Death Deck can, where you're milling 10 at a time. If you're milling, 2 here, 2 there, eventually that'll add up. But DXM in general is so aggressive that trying to play a game like that, where you're getting incremental mills throughout the game and trying to pull a later on refresh, probably just isn't as useful overall. Her once per game ability, which again, XC3, remove a piece. If you do up to 2 targets taken on your opponent's field, get minus 12k power until end of turn. So if you look at what the other 2 do, Deus fills your hand completely. So basically, it doesn't matter what your opponent has, you can just get exactly the 3 Signy that you need from your trash, assuming they're in there, which they probably should be. If you look at X kind of has the same effect where it's 2 potential damage, except she gets it through Assassin, which is way better than doing it through just vanishing Signy. So if you compare it, if you wanted to do something like Machina is obviously leaning more toward offense, but if you compare Machina to what X does, having Assassin is just a way better ability than just vanishing Signy for the most part. So right there, that kind of explains, I feel like, a lot of why you would prefer. If you're going to run Machina, you probably for the most part want to run X. There is some distinction between what assists you have options with and that kind of thing, but for the most part, I feel like just because of what X can do with the once per game ability, she kind of outshines Machina a little bit there. So with all that being said, it's not all bad for Machina. We'll move on to her assists. If you look at her level 1, it's 0 to grow, as most level 1s are. Enter effect to vanish target level 1 Signy on your opponent's field. But that's not all the text. There's another ability to enter, add target level 1 Signy without a guard from your trash to your hand. So the reason, again, this is another reason why it's sort of the theme of DXM, where you have these abilities that really look familiar, but they're just a little bit better. If you compare Machina to something like Love It or Hirana or Musica, like a lot of level 1 assists when they grow, if they vanish something, they just vanish something. And Machina does that, except she also adds a card to your hand. So it's somewhat limited by the fact that it's just a level 1, but for the most part, your opponent will pretty much always have a level one on their field. That's just how the math works. They're at level one, they obviously only have level ones. At two, their limit's five, so they'll probably have a level one. The only time they wouldn't is if they're just at three and their limit is if they have a bunch of twos. But yeah, they may have assists that grow into that kind of thing to push the limit up. But at that point, she's probably grown well beyond that anyway. The short version is you'll always find a way to use it. The fact that it's only level one does not limit it at all, really. And it also just adds a card to your hand for free from your trash. It's whatever level one you want, so you may be limited to what the actions you can get. But the fact that this is just Vanish Plus, I mean, there's nothing that any of the other teams have access to like this right now. The level two that I like, Machina Smash, it's one to grow, attack phase timing. So two things that you really like to see. Target Signy on your opponent's field get minus 12k power until end of turn. Also, you can pay a black to add Target Signy without a guard from your trash to your hand. So this is a really nicely costed, very efficient removal piece. If you compare it to something like Harana basically does the same thing, which is grow one, vanish 12k or less, attack phase. So basically the exact same thing, except she also has another ability where you can pay one black to get a card back to your hand. So again, if you compare Machina to other assists that do the same thing, she just straight up does them better. So it's also one of the reasons I think why Machina as a center is not as good, because her assists are so efficient and so good. Moving on to Deus assists, Deus Drive, her level 1 assist to vanish target level 2 or less Signy on your opponent's field. So again, you compare this one to Machina, which we just talked about, like Machina is just strictly better than even Deus. And Deus is not a bad ability. The fact that it gets level 2s is helpful at times, but again, it's pretty bog standard, level 1, clear a lane, main phase timing type of thing. So nothing to write home about here, but it's just a solid ability to have. Deus Shield. There's a lot of text here, so I'll kind of I'll read it and then I'll try to paraphrase it. So it's 3 to grow. The next 2 times you would take damage, instead you don't take the damage, and this Elrig gains the effect that at the end of turn you basically mill 5. So, and I can pay 3 more enter to do it again. So basically for 6 total enter, you can prevent the next 3 damage and potentially mill 15. So what this means is if you pay 3, the next 2 times you would take damage, it's prevented, and you, the Deus player, would mill 5 for each of those. So if you get hit twice, then you would mill 10. If you pay the 3 and get hit a third time, then you would mill a total of 15. So there's a little bit of risk reward here depending on how big your deck is. You can potentially cause your own refresh. But the fact that this basically for 3 enter prevents 2 damage full stop, it's not even, it's damage. I mean, you can use it to prevent even like a Harana Double Crush where you can't guard it, but you can Deus Shield it because it's preventing damage, which the Harana Double Crush does not do that. Like it would block basically the instances of the Double Crush. So this is an extremely powerful ability. The fact that it's milling, again, it's a little worrisome, but there's potential ways to mitigate that. In some respects, it could potentially fuel your abilities even further if you have ways to recur them back. Machina kind of does that herself, but there's other ways that you can kind of, power up yourself through your own graveyard type of thing. So, I mean, just the ability to stop damage basically in an instant for 3 enter is really good, and it's a very powerful effect. Finally, we have X assists. Her level 1 assist, vanish target Signy on your opponent's field with power 10k or less. Again, pretty bog standard. Basically what you'd expect to see from an aggressive type deck, which this is, and it sort of fits the theme of everything that they have going on. So not much else to say there. X Crossfire, enter. It's free to grow. It has main phase and attack phase timing, so that's great. You may pay colorless enter for each level of a target Signy on your opponent's field if you do vanish it. So it's kind of a modal cost that you target a Signy on your opponent's field, and depending on whatever level it is, if it's a level 3 Signy, you pay 3. If it's level 1 Signy, you pay 1. So in that way, it's really nice that it's flexible, that it doesn't use more enter than it necessarily needs. It also has a secondary enter effect to put up to 2 target cards in your opponent's enter zone that don't share a color with their center Elric into their trash. So not only is it potentially clearing a lane and preventing a damage for, again, between 1 and 3 enter, depending on what they get through, it's also potentially enter burning them, which is really good. And also it does so in such a way, if you do this on attack phase timing, it's basically past the window of Xenocluster. So you can enter burn them to potentially hurt them even further for your next turn, so that they may be in a way where they cannot respond with assists of their own. So this is a really good, really useful ability. The fact that it may cost 3 to vanish a Signy isn't the best, but it also does kind of enter burn them too, so that's potentially helpful as well. Um, it's just a really good card and does a lot of things really nicely. Moving on to some of the Signy we have access to, we'll start with Gullwing. Gullwing is actually in the starter deck. If you run Deus Ex Machina, if you buy it, you'll get 4 copies of it, which is kind of nice. Her auto effect is okay. It's a little situational. You have to discard a card to potentially, if you have discarded a card during your turn, you can potentially enter burn your opponent. It's not the kind of thing that I would necessarily rely on, but it's nice to have at the time. One of the more important abilities is to basically pay 2 red and 1 to give this Signy double crush until end of turn. So that's just a really good ability to have. It's non-conditional. You can just do it. I mean, it's the kind of thing that people run Nobunaga for, just for whatever, and Gullwing kind of does the same thing, but potentially can burn and enter as well if, under certain circumstances. So it kind of, again, it does a lot of the things that you see elsewhere, but it kind of does it more efficiently. We also have Kentucky. This is actually in the set that comes out. It has Harmony for 1 black Elrig, so you have to down a black Elrig, otherwise this enters down. It has an auto effect at the beginning of your attack phase. If there's a soul on your field and if your opponent has 2 or more cards in their enter zone, then they burn it, similar to how Gull burns it. So again, same type of effect where you're potentially burning your opponent's enter. Again, the thing that I like about it is the enter effect to pay a red and black to give it assassin. So similar to kind of how Gullwing, you get double crush to put pressure on, Kentucky can just give herself assassin, which I've talked at length in several videos about how I think assassin is great, and the fact that Kentucky just gets assassin whenever she wants at the cost of Harmony 1 black Elrig is the fact you've got 2 of them. If you're running X center, especially, I mean, you can basically play 2 Kentuckys with virtually no downside. So you have 2 assassins plus your Elrig attack plus whatever else you want to manage to do. If you're running Deus or Machina, it's a little bit trickier just because you want the Elrig to attack as well. But again, just a great Signy overall. The fact that it can gain Assassin at will is just so powerful, and it's pretty cheaply costed too. Gaining Assassin for only 2 enter is pretty good. Moving on to a couple of support pieces. Baphomet is a level 1 Signy, which I typically don't talk about on these, but I figured it's worth mentioning. This comes in the starter deck as well, so you'll get 4 of it. It has a constant effect that if you have 5 or more cards in your trash, it's plus 4,000 power, and it has an enter effect to put the top 3 cards of your deck into your trash. If you've seen my videos, especially some of the older ones where I talk about Sanbaka and talk about how strong Melissa is, Baphomet is just Melissa on steroids. I felt for a long time Melissa was the strongest Signy in the game, at least at level 1. Um, Nowadays, not so much, but the fact that Baphomet does everything that Melissa does, except she's just better. I mean, she's milling it for 3. She's pretty much always going to be a 7K if you have 2 of them on the field, which is great for dodging, Lancelots and Romales and that kind of thing. It makes it really sticky for a level 1 to have. The fact that she's milling you just kind of fuels, recursion strategies you may have. So all of the things that I talked about with Melissa in the past are just true with Baphomet, except she has no restrictions where Melissa only triggers the 4K based on virtual Signy. Baphomet just gets it, even including the spells too. It's not even just Signy. So this is a really good Signy. It kind of fuels you to the late game. It really protects you early on just because her constant ability is pretty easy to trigger. So you'll always have big bodies, especially early on in the board, which can help you kind of get to the late game with a decent life lead. This spell also comes in the starter deck, Burning Calamity. It's a black and a red to vanish target Signy on your opponent's field with power 12k or less, and then you mill them for 2. So it's similar to Deafening Inferno. I mean, it's the same kind of rate you would see on any type of removal spells. It hits bigger, so it costs a little bit more. It does have a life burst to vanish target up Signy, which is again Deafening Inferno, but it also has an option that if there are none, you can potentially mill your opponent or yourself for 4, depending on, again, what you may need. So, again, it's so easy to compare this to something like Deafening Inferno, and it's a little bit, it's more costed. I mean, it costs twice as much, but it just does more stuff, and it's similar to basically the type of thing that DXM runs. It's a lot of cards with effects you've seen before, but just a little bit better. And again, the fact that it costs more is a little bit, it's a little bit rougher, but it hits more things too, whereas Deafening Inferno couldn't hit a level 3 really for the most part. Burning Calamity really can. And that is it for Deus Ex Machina in a nutshell. So it's a pretty big nutshell. There's a lot to go over with some of the things they add, and again, analyzing them in comparison to some of the teams we already have. hopefully that sheds some light in terms of why they are so popular and viewed as so strong. The short version, as I've mentioned several times throughout the video, is that they just kind of do the same stuff, but they just do it better. And there's really no other way around it. They're very aggressive as well. It's the kind of thing, if you're playing a slower or more controlled deck, you just can't keep pace with all the things that they're doing, all the removal options they have, the flexibility in terms of using their piece for value or protection, or using that as, their Elrig center ability, that type of thing. So they have a lot of really good things going for them. I haven't really gone at length about the different build options you have. I've just sort of gone over high level stuff. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of build the deck. You can build it more black focused with recursion. You can build it more red focused with aggression, however you want to build it. There's a lot of good things going on here. So it will probably be a really popular team in the near future. It's going to be a strong team for sure, but I feel like a lot of people are going to be making the switch here pretty soon. So it's worth it to know what their effects are, what they have access to, and that kind of thing. So thanks for watching as always, and we will see you in the next one.